Professor Koh, thank you so much for this interview, for your time. I really appreciate your work and everything you have done in law, in science. So it has been my honor to have you as a guest on the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Okay, let's start with the current events. How do you see the 2024 presidential campaign in the States?
Well, obviously, it's an extremely consequential election. It's no surprise that I think that a re-election of Donald Trump would be a disaster. It's not so much Democratic versus Republican, except it's someone who has contempt for the rule of law, which is something that I've worked for my entire life. I'm also very concerned about his foreign policy positions. I represent Ukraine against Russia. I think Russia has violated international law in its behavior toward Ukraine, and Trump appears ready to abandon Ukraine if given the chance. And I think that's very threatening to other countries in Eastern Europe, who, as you know from your own personal experience, have struggled hard to get out from under the Russian orbit. And so I think that nevertheless, it's an extremely close election, so we'll see how it goes.
You were the 22nd legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State. So can you talk about what was that experience like for you?
Well, for an international lawyer, a public international lawyer, it's really probably the most exciting job you could have. You play several roles. You are the international legal advisor to the U.S. government, but particularly to the president, who was Barack Obama, and the Secretary of State, who was Hillary Clinton, both of whom I have great admiration for. Secondly, you run a law firm of public international lawyers, about 230 in the State Department, divided into 25 areas who cover every issue of international law that faces the U.S., which obviously is probably the most influential country in the world. And then third, you are a legal diplomat, and that you have to work together with alliances to try to manage the relationships and to reach a collective legal solution to emerging problem. And all three of these roles, advisor, head of a law firm, and legal diplomat, were very exciting and enjoyable roles.
Right. What's very interesting is that you've held positions at Harvard, at Oxford, at Cambridge, at Yale. So can you compare these universities in terms of their influence, their quality, and their historical significance?
I held no academic position at Harvard. I went to Harvard. I went to Harvard and I went to Harvard Law School, and I was on the overseers of Harvard, but I never taught there. But obviously it's probably the greatest university in the world, certainly the richest. I think those four universities are very special and traditionally have been. Yale, I love. I grew up in New Haven from when I was 6 years old. I've been a professor here for 40 years. I think we have the best law school in the world. And the specialty is a combination of humanity and excellence. I think we have the best students, the best faculty, and the best culture. Oxford I went to as a student, a graduate student, and I fell in love with England. I'm Korean American, and up until that point I was trying to learn more about Asia. And then I realized that many of the bases of my thinking was based in Anglo-American thought. And so I studied philosophy, politics, and economics. When I graduated, I went to law school, and I'd had nothing to do with law at Oxford. 25 years later, I went back as a visiting fellow at All Souls College, and I worked on international law issues there. And then most recently in 2021, I went back as the Eastman professor and wrote a book that just came out, National Security Constitution in the 21st Century. Meanwhile, my family has come to love Oxford also. We have many friends there. My son, who was only 6 years old when we first went, now, almost 30 years later, his best friend is still one of his best friends. So that's great. And finally, Cambridge. Obviously, having seen Harvard, Yale, Oxford, I felt that it was almost completing the square.
Right.
And they invited me to be the Goodhart professor, visiting professor. And I was just eager to see what it's like. I think it's, to me, it reminds me a little bit of Princeton University in the U.S. I have more loyalty to Oxford, but it was a wonderful year, and I think they really do have the strongest international law program in the UK. So it was a great experience to be there too.
During your time at Oxford, you were based at Magdalen College, right?
Yeah, Magdalen College.
Yeah, so I suppose that college is the best one for you at Oxford.
Yes, it is. Well, first of all, it's the most beautiful college. I think most people agree on that. Yeah. Secondly, it's probably the most cosmopolitan in that they have a long history of Americans and Australians and South African and Canadian students all living together. Third, and because it has beautiful grounds, all of the students, graduates and undergraduates, can live in the same, on the property of the college.
Yeah.
And third, I think they're very welcoming to their alumni. They made me an honorary fellow, which I found very touching, which allows me to go back even for one night, and I can sleep there and eat at the high table. And this is a great treat for me. So even if I have a very short visit, I try to get there. And even 6 hours back there reminds me of what it was like. And the good news is when I go there, I feel like I'm 20 years old again. I don't look in the mirror. And so I think I feel the way I did. The buildings are old, and so they haven't changed. And if I don't look in the mirror, I don't see how I've changed. So I also prefer Magdalen's location. And Magdalen also has this, it's next to the river, and they have about a mile and a half oval walkway called Addison's Walk, where the poet Joseph Addison used to walk. And when I applied for the scholarship that I got, the Marshall Scholarship, someone told me that the best thing about Magdalen was Addison's Walk. And in the interview, I don't know if I was going to get the scholarship or not, the interviewer said, I went to Magdalen, why do you want to go to Magdalen? And I just said, Addison's Walk. And I think that's what, he was delighted, and I think that's why I got the scholarship. It was just a lucky answer.
Right. That was definitely a big plus in your application for scholarship, for sure. Okay, so you wrote a book called The Trump Administration and International Law. How would you compare the Trump administration with the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, I think the Trump administration is transactional, and the Biden administration is relational. The Trump administration's motto was America First. And I think America First means America alone. I think Biden realized from the beginning that on all the major issues, climate change, fighting COVID, Russia, Ukraine, the U.S. had to lead a coalition or an alliance. And so he got NATO to band together. On all of these things, it was a multilateral effort. So, the Trump thinks in terms of deals, but human beings don't think in terms of deals, they think in terms of relationships. And therefore, if you're too fixated on transactions, you try to win a transaction and you lose the relationship. And, diplomacy is really like a marriage. You have to, each side has to give something. You have to have a common enterprise, and you need to have a common language. And Trump somehow thinks that confrontation and you can somehow win the battle when in fact it's a lose-lose proposition.
I see. What is your view on U.S. Connections with North Korea and America's forever war against al-Qaeda and Islamic State?
Well, those are two very big questions. Well, you know, obviously I'm a Korean American. My mother came in 1948, my father in 1949. They saw Korea divided, and my father's greatest dream was that Korea would be reunited. And I had hoped that I would see it in my lifetime. I don't know if I will. It's such a tragedy. You know, Republic of Korea, South Korea has done remarkably well economically with only half the country. I went to North Korea for 5 days with Madeleine Albright in 2000, and I thought that we were making progress. George W. Bush broke off the talks, and then Trump reopened those talks in a very short-sighted way. A good example was when we left in 2000, we said no U.S. president should meet the president of Korea without certain preconditions, which would be release of many political prisoners, allowing inspections into nuclear facilities, some commitments to a more peaceful form of engagement, willingness to slow down development of nuclear weapons. Trump, stupidly, the only word you can use, gave Kim Jong-un a meeting asking nothing. So the only person who benefited from this was Kim Jong-un. And Trump didn't even realize what a failure this was. And the United States is the #1 power in the world. North Korea is 196. And for him to give this away was just showed a total lack of diplomatic skill. Ending the forever war is something I've written about since 2013. This is really a product of September 11th, where after the horrible attack in New York City and Washington, D.C., Congress passed something called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. And then that war has expanded continually. Now it's being used even in a situation for which it's obsolete. And I credit Biden with withdrawing from Afghanistan, which I think was a wise step, even though it was traumatic how it was accomplished. But I don't think anybody really thinks that we should be there now, even though the Taliban have taken over and it's a bad situation. But I think that what ought to be done is that these standing authorizations for the use of military force should be repealed. Particularly there's a 1990 authorization that was originally passed against Saddam Hussein, who's long dead. And then there's another one in 2002, which is again about Saddam Hussein. And so it wasn't intended to operate against the current situation in Iran. And so the law should not be on the books.
Right, I see. Can you briefly talk about your experience with the Reagan, Clinton, and Bush administration? I know that you had some problems with Clinton administration at that time with Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, if I'm not mistaken.
No, well, it ultimately worked out. With Reagan, I was in the Justice Department, and that was the last time I'll work for a president I didn't vote for. I thought that Reagan took the country in a bad direction. Compared to now, he seems quite moderate. Bush started to return Haitian refugees, and my students and I filed a lawsuit against him in 1992. Clinton, who I supported, Bill Clinton, continued that policy, and so we continued the lawsuit against him. But I think Hillary Clinton was very sympathetic to our position. I met with her during that period, and it was clear that if she were a decision maker in the government, she would bring the Bush policy to an end, which eventually happened. And then later in that administration, 1998, I was invited to be the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. And Madeleine Albright was then my boss. And I remember saying, I've sued this administration. Are you sure you want me? And they said, yes, because if you defend our human rights policy, nobody will say that you're a yes man. You're just doing what they want. And then when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State under Obama, she asked me to be her lawyer.
Yeah.
And I got a chance to work very closely with her. One of my great regrets is that she was not president. I think she would have been one of the best presidents we ever had. In fact, she gave a speech at the convention for the Democrats just a month ago that again showed her, really extraordinary ability.
Right. How do you view the Russia-Ukraine war from a US perspective and just in general from a overall standpoint?
I'm glad that the United States stood up for Ukraine. I'm glad that they did it multilaterally through NATO. I think the Ukrainians have been extremely courageous. I think that Zelensky has done an extraordinary job as president. Nobody could have known, he was an entertainer, and who would know that he had this leadership ability. But we are at this moment, which is late September 2024, in a really pivotal moment. There's the Kursk offensive, where for the first time Ukrainian troops are inside of Russia, but at the same time they're losing ground in the Donbass. Next week I'm going to be in The Hague arguing for Ukraine about Russia's law of the sea violations, which are massive. I hope that this is helpful. There's 360 billion euro of Russian assets, central bank assets, that are frozen. And it would be good if this money could be devoted to Ukraine's reconstruction. And we're not yet at a peace negotiation or even a ceasefire. So there's a long way to go. So I'm always optimistic, but the next 6 months will be crucial.
Right. And to mention another war, which is currently a pretty hot topic, which is of course Israel-Palestine war. What do you think about that conflict throughout the history, culminating in last year?
I think it's a tremendous tragedy. I think that it's been an unstable situation since 1948. I think there was a glimmer of hope when we got to the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution. I think it's been very unfortunate that Netanyahu has been the president, and as time has gone on, I think he's become a worse and worse president and then you have the horrible tragedy of October 7th of last year, which is blatant war crimes by Hamas. So Israel certainly had a right to defend itself, but then the idea that this can be solved only by use of force seems very short-sighted. And as we speak now, the war cabinet has disbanded. Netanyahu seems to have only one way to go, which is to use force even against civilians. I don't think they're near to defeating Hamas by force. And he's refusing to enter a ceasefire. And what's been lost in the process is the fate of the Israeli hostages, and also, I think, what is the long-term fate of the Palestinians? And Kamala Harris, I thought, in the Democratic National Convention speech, took a position which both spoke up for Israel's right of self-defense and for the Palestinians' right to their own homeland and a two-state solution. And I think we have to do everything we can to get back to that. So I think it's a very dangerous situation, and I just pray that it ends up in a better place.
Right. how do you view the current state of international law in shaping U.S. foreign policy, especially in an area where global power dynamics are now shifting?
International law plays a particular role. It's like a riverbed, that if the conduct is in the river,
right,
following the established path, it's predictable. Others can join in. The rivers can join. You can have cooperative and combined strength, and less conflict and more collective will exerted in the same direction.
right.
This is obviously an extremely tumultuous time, and you know, the United States has, to my mind, correctly called out international humanitarian law abuses by the Netanyahu government, while still defending Israel's right of self-defense. And you know, I think you have to be able to say both, that both are true. I don't think you can be objective that 40,000 civilian casualties in Gaza seems extremely disproportionate, and I don't think you can just forgive that.
Right. What do you see as the most pressing challenges to human rights nowadays?
I think, frankly, it's very closely connected now. Well, number one is China's, the power of China and Russia, two leading powers, both of whom have a lot of contempt for human rights, but also exercise other kinds of power, economic and military. Secondly, I think fossil fuels and the addiction of the developed world to fossil fuels gives extraordinary power to autocratic individuals. That's not just in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, but also Venezuela, Russia. And the sooner we get away from our dependence on fossil fuels, the less leverage these autocrats can have on our willingness to look the other way when they commit human rights abuses. And you know, it's just an accident of geography that they're sitting on top of oil deposits. And it shouldn't be the case that that empowers people to extraordinary wealth, but it does.
Right. In your own view, how should international legal frameworks evolve to address new ethical dilemmas we have in today's world, like artificial intelligence and cybersecurity?
Yes, well, these have been two concerns of mine. I've been involved for the last 5 years with something called the Oxford process on international law protections in cyberspace.
Yes.
It's on the website of the ELAC, E-L-A-C, which is the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. And what we did during the pandemic was simply convene a group of about 150 international lawyers to state what we thought were the international rules about legitimate and illegitimate cyber activity. For example, I think no one would think that it's lawful to use cyber attacks to interfere with the manufacture of vaccines in a pandemic, or to interfere with the operation of a hospital in a global health crisis, or to interfere with an election. So we simply just stated these rules. Artificial intelligence, I think, is even more pressing, because there's a move, and they're already here, lethal autonomous weapons systems. And I think what you cannot do is remove human control from the moment of lethal decision making. To kill someone is a decision, a godlike decision, and it should be made by a human being, not by a machine. There's a real respect in which Nuremberg process made sure that everybody was responsible. Before Nuremberg, if there was a genocide, the people who committed the genocide would say, we were just following orders. And the people who ordered it would say, we didn't know what they were doing, and everybody got off. Nuremberg said, no, everybody's responsible. With artificial intelligence, we're now back to a situation where the programmer could say, it wasn't me, and the hardware engineer could say it wasn't me, and then the person who's operating the drone or unmanned vehicle can say it's not me, and then nobody's responsible again.
Yeah.
And so just to be clear, obviously technology is going to be part of our life. I do not object to the presence of technology. What we should object to is the exclusion of human decision making, especially when human lives are involved. And it turns out that all you need to do is use GPS or autocorrect on your phone to see artificial intelligence makes mistakes, and the ultimate decision maker to override has to be a human being exercising the last clear chance. And I think that's especially true if lethal targeting decisions are going to be made.
Right, and besides artificial intelligence and cyber security, we also have quantum, also represents a big challenge to our society. And in that terms, Stanford Law School has open center for responsible quantum tech, which I'm a part of, and we are working on ensuring that the quantum development goes in an ethical manner. So
I'm interested to learn more.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so can you share a memorable experience from your career that had a significant impact on your views about international law and human rights?
Well, the most important were from my father. My father was in the Korean government, the democratic government. It was overthrown by a dictatorship, and he refused to serve the democratic government. And he refused to serve the dictatorship, and was exiled. He actually died 35 years ago today. But I was thinking about this on my way to meet you. But he said something very profound. In 1974, I went to Korea as a college student. I wasn't even 20. And while I was there, someone tried to assassinate the dictator and failed. And they had martial law, and there were tanks on the street, and there were soldiers carrying guns, and there was a curfew. You couldn't go outside. And I called my father, and he said, Richard Nixon just resigned as president, and Gerald Ford is president of the United States. And I said, are there any tanks in the street, and any soldiers, any guns? And he said, no. And I said, well, why is it that the most powerful country in the world just changed power peacefully, and this little country of Korea has never had a peaceful transition? And he said, that's the difference between rule of law and rule of individuals. He said, in Korea, if the troops obey you, they call you president.
Right.
But in America, if you're president, like Gerald Ford, the troops will obey you. And that's the difference between the rule of law and the rule of individuals. And that was the moment I decided, really, this idea of the rule of law is so important, and that it was something that I would fight for. And then, my father wrote his doctoral dissertation about the law of the sea, where he was urging the creation of a law of the sea treaty, which later came about. I went over to argue at the Permanent Court of Arbitration on behalf of Ukraine. And I was reading his dissertation. I brought it with me.
Right.
And I realized what he was really saying was that international law is a way that a weaker country like Korea can equalize the playing field with a larger country like Japan. Right. And this really is what we were trying to do for Ukraine against Russia. That in the courtroom, the judges have to rule based on law, not based on who's more powerful. And that's a way in which international law gives a standard by which you can evaluate whether somebody is acting like an outlaw or acting lawfully.
I see.
So that's why I've continued in this tradition. You know, it's obviously something that fails quite regularly, but on the other hand, it's worth fighting for.
I see. And one final question to mention your newest book. So your newest book, The National Security Constitution in 21st Century, explores the growing imbalance of institutional powers in American foreign affairs and national security policy. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you for asking me about it. When I came to Yale to teach in 1985, which is 39 years ago, I had just come from the US government, the Reagan administration, and I decided to teach a course called National Security and Foreign Relations Law. While I was doing that, something happened called the Iran-Contra affair, and I decided to write an article and then a book about it, which came out in 1989. What I argued at the time was that the constitutional design is for shared power, but that in fact there's constant pressures for the president to act alone, and that this battle between balanced power and executive unilateralism is a consistent theme of American history. When I finished the book 34 years ago, I thought, maybe someday I'll write the book again. And then as I watched the executive power grow, I started to think that now was the time. So when I went to Oxford in 2021, I decided to update it, and then this is the book. It's about 70% new, and it's up to the present day, today. And last thing discussed is the Biden administration. One of the ironies here is that lawyers for the president have, in good faith, I think, tried to give the president freedom to address national security threats. So their focus has been freedom for the president. And what they don't focus on is that when this is a consistent pattern, the president must be more free, what if the president becomes the national security threat? There's very little constraint on him. And I think we saw this with Donald Trump. You know, here's a person who has no respect for the rule of law, who thinks I have this executive power as a matter of constitutional law, and I can do whatever I want, and if anyone's challenging me, it's unconstitutional. And what we've seen is how he's been able to evade the legal process, how he's been able to, escape being disqualified from running for election. As we started the interview, he may be elected again, and then he will not face the election again. And so, where is the constraint? And this creates a real possibility that foreign affairs, we have no checks and balances, and the idea of our Constitution is checks and balances. So, to me, people tend to think, well, let's elect Kamala Harris, but it's bigger than personalities. It's structure. The executive overreaches, Congress does nothing, the courts defer, and then the president gets more and more unilateral behavior. And so I think we have to recognize that this is a structural problem that needs structural fixes. And my book makes a lot of proposals for how these structural fixes can occur. So the real reason for it is I'm a professor, but I've worked in the US government for 10 years of my career, a quarter of my career, 5 different decades, 4 different presidents. And it occurred to me, this might not happen very often. And if in 5 years' time a student says, what should we do about this problem? How do we fix it? How did it happen? I thought there should be a book you give them and says, this explains how it happened, this explains the structural problem, and this explains how you fix it, if you want to fix it. And at least then, my life's work would have given this comprehensive solution to a persistent problem. And at the end of the day, isn't that what professors are supposed to do? They should identify real problems and then try to help solve them and try to propose realistic solutions and enduring solutions. And so that's what I tried to do.
Thank you so much. And for anyone who would like to buy this book, I'll put a link in the description of this video so that you can find it very easily.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Professor Koh, it was my pleasure to host you and my honor. I really like this conversation, and I really respect you as one of the few experts in the field of law and U.S. foreign policy and human rights. So thanks so much for this interview.
Thank you, Mr. Kukina.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.